Welcome to RISK66 Accelerated Training video on exposures. I'm Tim Coomer. Let's get started. In this video, we'll discuss several questions. What are exposures and what are they used for in an actuarial analysis? What do exposure-based loss estimates provide better than traditional loss estimation methods? And which exposure base fits my needs? Exposures are defined as the extent of risk presented by one or more entities that have been provided coverage under a plan or contract. In plainer terms, they are another way for an actuary to examine an organization's vulnerability to risk and thus losses. Beyond the three traditional methods of estimating ultimate losses, namely the incurred, paid, and case methods, there are three methods which utilize exposures for their ultimate loss estimations. These are called the projection methods and include what we will call the standard projection method, incurred Bornhueter-Ferguson method, and paid Bornhueter-Ferguson method. The latter two may also be known as the Cape Cod methods. In essence, they compare historical ultimate losses and exposures by policy period, which are both adjusted to make up for inflation and changes in retention level. These comparisons create what is called a pure loss rate, which, when multiplied by a policy period's exposure, provides an ultimate loss estimate. This is a very brief overview. If you are interested in a more in-depth discussion on the projection methods, please be sure to see our video on those topics. Before we dive into the benefits of the projection methods, let's first talk briefly about the limitations of loss development factors, which are the crux of the traditional methods. Due to the way loss development factors are created via loss development triangles, more and more uncertainty is added the closer one gets to the inception of a policy period. This is due to the fact that each factor used in an LDF's creation is itself an estimate. When the factors are multiplied together, the uncertainty is compounded. The projection methods usually provide a more accurate loss estimation for the most recent policy periods than the traditional methods. They are inversely related to the traditional methods in terms of uncertainty, as projection estimates increasingly lose their value the further back in history they go. To alleviate this slightly, we use the Bornhueter-Ferguson methods as well, which use a combination of both the standard projection method, the traditional incurred, and paid methods. Next, let's look at the topic of trending and why do we need trending? It is mostly due to our need to make up for the issue of inflation. $1 of payroll from 3 years ago does not have the exact same value as $1 in today's market. To compensate, we use standard industry factors that can vary depending on the location and industry that the exposures come from. When multiplied by the original losses or exposures, they provide an estimate of the current equivalent. Here's an example of how the exposure base for a workers' compensation study, which is payroll, is trended to current dollars. So this analysis was being completed for a 2014 time period, and the historical exposure amounts, for example, for November 1st, 2010 was $1,522,500. That is multiplied by an exposure inflation trend factor to bring those 2010 dollars up to 2014, and the actuary has determined that number is 1.071. So the exposure payroll is multiplied by 1.071, and that is how we determine the trended exposure amount of $1,630,598. Using the correct exposure base is extremely important to the accuracy of the projection methods. Exposure bases depend on the policy and industry being analyzed and can range from payroll to location amounts to income and cash flow. Ultimately, you should consult with your actuary and decide together on what would create the most accurate representation of your risk. There are some common practices when choosing an exposure base. For workers' compensation studies, typically it's payroll. For general liability or products liability, it's typically sales. And for automobile liability, it's typically automobiles. Along with using the correct base, ensuring accuracy in your exposure amount is necessary to ensure that the projection methods are as certain as possible. This does not just mean the accuracy of the numerical amount. There are plenty of factors in exposures which must be considered depending on the base. Above all, be sure to communicate with your actuary in regards to how your exposure was calculated, what was included, and what was excluded. Let's look at a quick and simple example of how an exposure base might relate to ultimate incurred losses for product liability. If you were to use automobiles as the exposure base, we can see here that over the course of 5 years, that trended down, while the product liability amount of losses trended up fairly significantly. Now, on the other hand, if we use sales as our exposure base for product liability, we see that positive trend there in the sales number, and we see a corresponding trend in the incurred losses for product liability that seems related to the exposure base. And that's what we want to see and what we expect to see, and why it's important to choose the appropriate exposure base that's going to indicate how the losses may move in future years. Though the projection methods provide a great deal of value to loss estimates in recent policy periods, their accuracy lessens when used for more historic periods. Typically, analyses provide projection methods for the 3 to 4 most recent policy periods. Very rarely are they used beyond that. The choice between traditional and projection methods compares the amount of uncertainty introduced when creating the loss estimates. Traditional methods are more certain for older periods, and projection methods are more certain for newer periods. An underused aspect of exposures is the loss cost analysis. Loss cost analyses are dependent on the client being able to provide a very specific type of exposure, payroll for workers' compensation, in terms of what are called class codes. If these can be attained, a loss cost analysis can be completed, which provides one of the most accurate loss projections possible by examining what areas of payroll contain the most risk. For example, if a company employs a large number of office workers, who are typically low risk, and a small number of construction workers, who are typically higher risk, this is recognized in the loss cost analysis. Due to the granularity of the data provided, one is able to introduce a weighting system. This is a very simplified example of a loss cost analysis. This organization has 4 payroll codes. We see the payroll amount for each of those payroll classifications, and then we see the loss cost estimated for a $500,000 retention for each of those codes. And this determines the projected loss by payroll code. So by breaking the total payroll into class codes and estimating the loss costs per class code, we get a better estimate of the total projected losses, and we better understand in which class codes the greatest exposure lies. One of the more common uses of the loss cost analysis is a comparison of losses under various retention levels for the projected period. This is especially useful for organizations that do not have a great deal of loss history, as none is necessary to complete this analysis. Of course, this is not the only use for loss costs. They can also be incorporated into a standard actuarial analysis to provide more information that your actuary can use to ensure accuracy. Here's a quick example of how loss costs can be used to compare the projected losses given 2 different retention or deductible levels. For the 4 payroll codes and the given payroll exposure amounts, we've estimated a loss cost for the $100,000 retention and for the $500,000 retention, and then computed the projected losses at the $100,000 retention level and the $500,000 retention level. Now, this type of analysis, which can be completed by your actuary, is helpful in selecting the appropriate retention for your organization. Here we see a comparison of a loss projection using a pure loss rate and the total payroll exposure base versus a loss cost analysis where the payroll has been broken into the 4 class codes and a loss cost has been computed for each of those class codes, and then a loss projection for each class code and a total loss projection is generated in the loss cost analysis. Because the risk is examined more granularly in the second example where we're using loss costs, it is more accurate. Providing accurate exposures is a great way to ensure certainty in your actuarial analysis. With this knowledge, you should be able to communicate more effectively with your actuary regarding your exposure and the ways it is being used. For expanded information, see the resources listed along with this video or contact Sigma Actuarial Consulting Group at support@sigmaactuary.com. Thank you for taking time to watch this accelerated training video on exposures from RISK66.